My dear brothers and sisters, here at Holy Cross, we continue our series with Paul's letter to the Romans with chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. In chapter 4, verse 9, Paul says, "Is this blessedness then pronounced only on the circumcised, or also on the uncircumcised? We say faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised." Now, after beginning this chapter with Abraham and then going to David, Paul is now circling back to Abraham. He says, look, we've talked about this before. The blessedness that's pronounced, it's not only for the circumcised, it's for the circumcised and the uncircumcised. And Paul says, why would we say that? Well, he says, the righteousness that came by faith through Abraham came before the circumcision. Circumcision was important. It was a sign. It was a symbol that bound Abraham to God. But in reality, that which really bound Abraham to God was Abraham saying yes to God. It was always the yes. Yes, God, I will do this. Yes, God, I will be with you. Yes, God, I will believe you. Yes, God, I will be for you and with you. I will love you. Now, what he's saying here is this. And this is really important, not just for this letter that he's writing to the Romans, but the letter he writes to the Galatians and the letter he writes to the Ephesians and the Corinthians. Look, you don't have to become a Jew to become one of God's chosen people. You get to continue being a Greek. You get to continue being a Roman. You get to be whoever you are. Because your primary identity is now rooted in Jesus. And because it's rooted in Jesus, your primary identity is rooted in God. Now, that might have been, circumcision might have been a symbol for Jews, but he says it's not really a symbol for those who are following Jesus. Because remember what Paul says. Jesus isn't interested in your foreskin being circumcised. He's interested in your heart being circumcised. He's interested in if in your heart you're able to love your brother and sister. If in your heart you're able to love God. That's the circumcision that Paul is talking about, because that's what Jesus is ultimately interested in. When you follow Jesus, your heart becomes circumcised through love. You know that small yes that I talked about in the last episode, where it's just really about me getting what I want? Having our heart circumcised means that our heart is now able to say yes for God. It's now able to say yes for our neighbor. Whether we know our neighbor or we don't know our neighbor, we're able to have a heart that can say yes to the other. Now, we know that's not easy. If it were easy, we'd all be singing in the heavenly choir already. If it were easy, then the Jews would never have needed the 10 Commandments. If it were easy, Adam and Eve would never have sinned. If it were easy to love our neighbor as ourselves, Cain never would have killed Abel. The fact of the matter is, whether we like it or not, we, as part of humanity, have a lot of blood on our hands, have a lot of envy on our hands, have a lot of hate in our heart. And part of what Paul is saying here is this. Jesus is after the heart, because ultimately that is what will put us in line with God. Now, Paul continues in verses 11 and 12 when he says, he received the sign of circumcision, that he being Abraham, the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe without being circumcised, and who thus have righteousness reckoned to them. And likewise, the ancestor of the circumcised, who are not only circumcised, but who also follow the example of the faith that our ancestor Abraham had before he was circumcised. Now, there is a lot there in those two verses. First of all, we see here, he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith. So, circumcision is a sign of what has already happened, and it's a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith, which is to say, the yes that Abraham gives back to God, that is what is of the essence. Circumcision might be a sign and it might be a seal, but it's not the essential thing. The essential thing is the faith that Abraham has. And as he points out, he had that faith before he was circumcised and after he was circumcised. It says the purpose was to make him the ancestor of all who believe without being circumcised and who thus have righteousness reckoned to them. Which is to say, guess what? All of you, regardless of whether you are circumcised or not, regardless of whether you are a Jew by blood ancestry or not, you are all Abraham's offspring by faith. Which is to say, the doorway is wide in many ways. You know, anybody gets through if they say they want to go through. Anybody gets to come to the party if they want to be in the party. Now, on one hand, this has always been a problem for people because you know what? If I get in, I oftentimes want to close the door and not let the great unwashed come in after me. But the reality is, as Paul would say, if even I can get in, then perhaps others should be let in as well. So he goes on and he says, and likewise the ancestor of the circumcised, who are not only circumcised, but who also follow the example of the faith of our ancestor Abraham before he was circumcised. Well, look, here's the deal. You know those 12 apostles? They were all circumcised Jews. All right, I got bad news for you. None of the apostles were Gentiles. Well, what does that mean? What it means is this. We know that the early Christian community was predominantly Jewish. Now, we also know that Paul has fights with Peter about who should hear the good news. And Paul says, guess what? You know what, Peter? You're not that special. You aren't the only one who gets to hear the good news. Everybody gets to hear the good news, whether they be Jew or Gentile, whether they be circumcised or uncircumcised. Everybody is entitled to hear the good news, because if you have a yes in your heart for God, then you are a child of Abraham by and through faith. And if you are a child of Abraham, guess what he would say? You're a friend of Jesus. And if you're a friend of Jesus, you're an heir of the promise of Abraham, and the promise given in and through Jesus of salvation, of justification, of sanctification, of righteousness, of love, of transformation, of salvation, of healing. I think some days I wish I could close the door and be alone in the room of salvation by myself. It doesn't work that way. as Jesus would say, and Paul would say, get over yourself. Open that door wide and help others say yes to God as you said yes to God. Amen. And God bless.